Hey kids, Flexing Teacher Weber here. I hope you're having a good day. Today I want to review everything we've done so far this week on percents. I want to take a look at some of the main points. So we started off the week talking about how percent means a fraction out of 100. And we looked at some pictures and determined their percent by counting the number of squares in the hundreds grid. And we also talked about how not every picture is going to be out of 100. So if you get a fraction, say in this one, where 3 out of 12 are red, you might have to put that fraction in lowest terms, and then you can determine the percent by making it out of 100, or in this case, using some of the fractions that we should already know about, like 1/4 and 3/4. And then we talked about how you can take fractions and make them an equivalent fraction out of 100 to make them a percent. So, if it's out of 10, timesing by 10 to get 100. If it's out of 20, timesing by 5. If it's out of 25, you can times by 4. If it's out of 50, you can times by 2. We looked at all those situations. And then we talked about how you might have a fraction where you have to divide to make it out of 100, like, making 20 out of 200, 10 out of 100, and so on. And we also talked about how to make a decimal into a percent by mentally multiplying by 100. And that causes the decimal point to shift over 2 spots to the right. So we looked at a bunch of questions where we mentally multiply by 100 to make a decimal into a percent. I'd just like to review a little bit of that today by doing this chart. So we have this chart here, and we want to make these fractions and decimals into percents. Well, let's look at the fraction 4/5. And we're going to make it into a decimal and a percent. Well, last week we were looking at fractions to decimals. To make this into a decimal, you could times by 2 to get 10. And times the top by 2 to get 8 out of 10. And since there's 1 0 now, there would be 1 decimal spot in which we would put an 8. And a 0 in front. And then to make that decimal into a percent, I could mentally multiply by 100. And that would shift the decimal over 1, 2. We'd put a 0 in that open spot, and that would give us the percent now. The percent would be 80%. Now, if I wanted to go directly from fraction to percent, I could have done this. I could have just made a fraction out of 100, right? Because percent means out of 100. I could have done 5 times 20 is 100. So 4 times 20 is 80 out of 100. And 80 out of 100 is 80%. Okay. The decimal, 22 hundredths. Well, to make that a percent, I mentally multiply by 100, which shifts the decimal over 1, 2. Which means the percent is going to be 22%. And then if I want to make that decimal into a fraction, I'm just going to erase this. I could say, you know what? Okay, there's 2 decimal spots. So the denominator of that fraction has to have 2 zeros and a 1 in front. So it's out of 100. And then that's 22 out of 100. And look at that. That matches the percent, right? The percent is 22%, which means 22 out of 100. And then I could put that fraction in lowest terms by dividing by 2, and I would get 11 over 50. So look at all the things we can do now. Okay, the fraction 13 over 20. How could I make that a decimal? Well, remember, to make fractions into decimals, I want to try to make them out of 10, 100, or 1,000. I can make this out of 100 by timesing by 5. 20 times 5 is 100. 13 times 5 is 65. 2 zeros means 2 decimal spots where we would put a 6 and a 5 and a 0 in front. And then remember, 65 out of 100 would make that 65%. And I could also do this, remember? If I want to take a decimal into a percent, I can mentally multiply by 100, and 2 zeros on 100 shift the decimal 1, 2. And I would get the percent that way as well. So everything's sort of coming together now. Okay, last question. 0 and 800ths. It's got a decimal there. Well, maybe I'll turn it to a percent first by mentally multiplying by 100. Shift the decimal 1, 2. The decimal ends up behind the 8. So that means that's 8%. Okay, now, to make 800ths a fraction, well, there's 2 decimal spots. That means my fraction is going to have 2 zeros and a 1. What's going to go on top of that fraction? The digits behind the decimal, 0 and 8. But I'm not going to write the 0 there for 8. I'm just going to have 8. And there's my fraction. And look at that. That matches the percent, right? 8 out of 100 is 8%. Now I should still put this in lowest terms by dividing by 4. Divide by 4. And that's 2 over 25. So those are the main things you have to be able to do so far. You have to be able to take a fraction and make it a percent. You have to be able to take a decimal and make it a percent. You have to be able to take a fraction and make a decimal, or a decimal and make a fraction. Okay? You've got an assignment to do today. Use this chart to help guide you through that assignment. That's all for now. Flexing Teacher Weber, out.